know, people look at the Sega CD as a horrible console, a horrible idea, and one of the main reasons the Genesis lost traction with the hardcore gamer back in the 90s. There's a lot to be said for that. That is a fair approach, and I totally appreciate that. You do need to appreciate full motion video games in order to get the most out of your Sega CD, because a lot of these games really want to take advantage of the CD medium. You know, the compact disc could hold a lot of information, and so what they wanted to do is maximize it. And because the machine itself, the core machine that the Sega CD required in order to play at all, that being the Genesis, was not capable of anything but 16-bit graphics, very much like the graphics we saw in our 16-bit Genesis cartridges. And so we were, though it was Sega, or rather CD technology, we were very, very far away from the CD technology that would follow the 16-bit era with the 32-bit era, PlayStation and Saturn. 3D graphics, very far from it. So they used the CD technology to basically record films and design games where the central core goal would be to have you as the player hit buttons in time, you know, as cued to do so, in order to further the plot by basically tapping into new video footage. Not a particularly successful genre, but one that I appreciate as mostly a cultural of cultural significance. But the Sega CD also had a number of neat things. It had a number of neat full motion video games that set a lot of the time it was released. So you'll find that a lot of the early Sega CD games were actually full motion video games. Again, that lets you construct or make your own video. There was a whole make your own video series, and it was a music video that you were making here, and you were basically cutting and pasting pre-shot pieces with the likes of favorites such as Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch, Criss Cross, the Adolescent Rappers, and also a personal fave, and the one of these three that I do indeed own, CNC Music Factory. Yes, indeed that happens. So culturally, like I said before about the Genesis, Sega was right in there with the culture of the time, the pop culture of the time, the attitude, the vivaciousness of that time. And so that was clearly reflected in some of their early Sega CD efforts. Not so much in some of the later stuff, you know, as pop culture moved on from those groups specifically, Sega kind of lost. Those games became jokes, you know, and Sega, as the producers of that product, also sort of wore that joke on its sleeve, whether it liked it or not. And so there was that to consider. But the Sega CD also featured a number of unique games to the machine that were quite good. The Lunar series, for you RPG fans out there. Before it was ported over the PlayStation, of course, that was a Sega CD series. And a good one, and a very good one. They had some really good RPGs on the Sega CD that were not available to Genesis owners, that is, people who own just the core console that the Sega CD would plug into. They did not have access to this great lineup of Japanese RPGs. Also, if you're into Blade Runner, the guy who did Metal Gear Solid, that whole series, the only English language version of that available, period, is on the Sega CD to this day. And I, among others, really look forward to seeing this released in some form or another via download in the hopefully near future. You know, a lot of people look at the Sega CD. The version of the Sega CD, by the way, that I have is the CDX. I have the Sega CDX, and it's more or less a collector's item, though frankly, you know, it's only for those who care. Really, it's about the games, and the games were not so bad. The reason I value my Sega CD is, A, I got it cheaper, I bought it well after the fact, but also, as a huge fan of the Sega Genesis library, the Mega Drive library of games, a lot of what I consider, and what I think just generally are, the definitive versions of some of my very favorite games came out for the Sega CD. So, for instance, if you wanted to get the best version of the very first Earthworm Jim, the Sega CD had it. It was just called Earthworm Jim Special Edition. And it was good enough. It featured an extra level, and it was good enough that it was the version that received a port to the PC, the personal computer. You know, Echo the Dolphin 1 and 2. I love those games on the Genesis, but the Sega CD versions came with CD sound, you know, that streamed off. The audio streamed straight from the disc. And there were cinematics that were computer generated, which was a big deal at the time. Now we look back at, you know, computer-generated or computer-rendered cinematics that are shown to the player between stages of a game, we see that as like, okay, whatever, I can't play it, so what's the big deal? But let's keep in mind that back in, I think the machine was released in 91, I think it was 91, maybe 92, I don't remember when it was initially released, but when it came out, the idea of streaming video from a console was amazing. And so people were way into it, well after the Sega CD, in fact. In fact, that was one of the key achievements, I would say, of CD technology, early CD gaming technologies. And so the Sega CD, though often really chided for not having much value because it didn't present to people, to early adopters, the people who picked this up when it was relevant, frankly, they were disappointed because their software library was not that much different than the standalone Genesis software library. In fact, the games were certainly not as numerous, and then the quality of the versions didn't do enough to justify the additional money spent to get this additional add-on. And so I feel their pain, but only to an extent, because since I got my machine for less, much later, after my 3DO, which was after my 128-bit, which was after my blah, 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 I got it for less, and also I got to enjoy the best version of Mickey Mania. You know, I got to enjoy that. You know, and it does have some exclusives on it that are superb. So the Sega CD, though not really respected as an important standalone product, did offer standalone software that I think, in a lot of ways, not only proves the value, the quality of the Sega Genesis library by presenting those games in their polished, their spit-shine versions, but also had some very unique, I guess you'd call them games. I see them as experiments. A lot of the full motion video stuff I see as experiments. So I think as a games console, it wasn't too hot for those who bought it for the initial price of, I think, $400. For those who bought it much later and have an appreciation for, video gaming as a pastime, I do look at it as home to some of the greatest interactive experiments out there. So if you have a taste for the odd and often bumbling, it's a great way to basically see the stretch marks of our industry. The Sega CD. Also, the Sega CD, and I forgot to mention this earlier, the 32X was a console that was also an add-on to the Sega Genesis. Yes, Sega added yet another piece of kit to their lovely Genesis that brought it down, brought the whole package down, called the 32X. This was it's called the Black Mushroom by many. You plug it into the top of your Genesis as you would a cartridge, and it then has a cartridge slot on top of it that has its own special proprietary cartridges that allowed you to do, and the machine allowed you to play 3D graphics, and the colors were so great, and all this stuff that it promised. And ultimately, people have argued the machine was much more capable than publishers or developers really tapped out of it. But frankly, it doesn't matter. You know, the public knows what you present to it, and frankly, the 32X collection, which I think consists of 36 or so games in total, did not exactly set the world on fire, though it again has some decent games and some fantastic exclusives. One particular exclusive would be that I really liked would be Virtua Racing Deluxe. Now, yes, this is an upscaled version of the Genesis counterpart, but it really was superb at the time, and it really offered enough to qualify it as a unique experience. Also, Virtua Fighter, was coming out for the original Saturn, and the 32X version came out just before the Saturn, I believe, and offered a gameplay experience that a lot of aficionados of that series, at the time anyway, thought was preferable to the Saturn version. So you certainly weren't lost. They also had Star Wars Arcade. If you want that, you have to go to the 32X. Is it that fantastic? Not really, but it's interesting. Good version of Blackthorn. It had some stuff on it, and so it was of value to an extent, but again, it's more of a curio. You do it because you want to see the experiments. These were closer to actual games because gameplay was more at the heart of 32X games over Sega CD games for the most part. But you certainly didn't get your dollar's value out of purchasing and playing these games. You really didn't. So it's better to go back, and that's kind of the way I approach it.